A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Well, good morning, Mr. Secretary. Welcome back. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you the policies of the Department of Labor, which impact countless workplaces and millions of workers across the country. As I've said before, it's the responsibility of this committee to ensure those policies are being administered in a way that best protects the interest of workers and employers and American taxpayers as well. This is a responsibility we take seriously, especially at a time when many working families and small businesses are still struggling to get by. There is no question the economy has shown signs of modest improvement, and we certainly welcome every new job that's created. But there's also no question many Americans feel they are slipping further behind in an economy that isn't meeting its full potential. At an event in Raleigh, North Carolina, former President Bill Clinton referred to the President's recent State of the Union address and said, quote, "Millions of people look at that pretty picture of America he painted and they cannot find themselves in it to save their lives," close quote. We don't agree on a lot of things, but President Clinton has rightly summed up the frustration many Americans feel. Month after month, we exceed low expectations, and that simply isn't good enough. It's not good enough for the tens of millions of workers still sitting on the sidelines. It's not good enough for the nearly 6 million Americans who need full-time jobs but can only find part-time work. And it's not good enough for those families whose incomes remain flat. We need to do better, and there are opportunities to do better. However, those opportunities will be lost if the Department continues to push an extreme regulatory agenda. For example, we both agree federal overtime rules need to be changed. The committee has held numerous hearings with witnesses who testified that these rules are so convoluted that well-meaning, law-abiding employers often get tied up in red tape and run afoul of the law. The overtime rules are also outdated, denying men and women the ability to balance work with their personal or family needs. We have said repeatedly we want to partner with the Department in a serious effort to streamline and modernize overtime protections. Unfortunately, the Department is pursuing an approach that will do nothing to provide employers with more clarity and certainty. To make matters worse, the Department's proposal will actually stifle workplace flexibility and make it harder for lower-income Americans to move up the economic ladder. These and other consequences will unfold in communities across the country, in local retail stores, small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and community colleges. The very places that can least afford it will be hit the hardest. In addition to overtime, there is also broad bipartisan agreement we need to strengthen policies governing retirement advice. Of course, there are also strong bipartisan concerns with the Department's fiduciary proposal. As Dr. Rowe suggested at a hearing last year, if we applied the same regulatory regime on the medical profession, patients would have less access to trusted physicians, and the same will be true for those seeking retirement advice. Because of the rule, many low- and middle-income families will have less access to affordable retirement advice, and fewer small businesses will offer retirement plans. Thanks to the hard work of Dr. Rowe and others, there is a bipartisan alternative that would protect access to affordable retirement advice and ensure advisors serve their clients' best interest. This legislation is a strong foundation to address a shared priority if the Department will abandon its flawed partisan proposal. Mr. Secretary, I strongly encourage you to take a step back and build bipartisan consensus in these and other important areas. The Department's my way or the highway approach will not deliver the lasting positive change working families and job creators need to move this country forward. The only way to do that is for the administration to work with members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. I would also encourage the Department to renew its focus where bipartisan consensus has already delivered results, such as workforce development and multi-employer pensions. The President noted recently the importance of providing new skills to those searching for work. Yet the Department has failed to implement the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in a timely manner. A new report by the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office confirms the consequences of the Department's inaction, and we hope the implementation process will conclude without further delay. Finally, Mr. Secretary, you played an integral role in our efforts to reform the multi-employer pension system. Your continued leadership is needed to solidify the gains we've made and to modernize the system for future generations of workers and retirees. Our success in these areas demonstrates what's possible when extreme policies are set aside and we work together in good faith toward a common goal. In the coming months, I hope we seize the opportunities we have in order to make a real difference in the lives of America's workers and employers. Let me now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Scott, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Perez, for being with us this morning. We know the United States has emerged from the depths of the Great Recession with steady economic growth. Here's some facts. More than 14 million jobs have been created over the last 6 years, extending the longest streak of private sector job growth on record. 242,000 jobs were created in February, and the unemployment rate has dropped to 4.9% from a high of 10%. Over the last 6 months, the labor participation has grown as more people are reentering the workforce. Although the growth in the global economy has slowed to the lowest level since 2009, the United States now has the highest growth rate compared to other advanced economies. This is occurring even while domestic companies are battling the economic headwinds from a strong dollar that makes our exports more expensive in the global market. Despite this economic good news, we also know that America's middle class has not fully recovered, and too many Americans remain underemployed. For example, 15 million people are working part-time, not because they want to, but because they can't find full-time work. Others are unemployed or discouraged from seeking work. Wages have been stagnant for the middle class in terms of in real terms for the last 4 decades, while over 90% of new income during the recent recovery has been concentrated in the hands of the top 1%. It is well established that it was well established that the link between productivity gains and wages in our economy has been broken for the past generation. This chart shows that from the 1950s through the 1970s, as productivity increased, so did wages. But around the 1970s, 73, there was a break where wages were essentially stagnant as productivity continued to grow. This chart shows that the rich are getting richer because the productivity is producing more wealth, but the workers aren't getting that the benefit of that productivity. Standard & Poor's has studied whether the U.S. economy would be stronger with a narrower income gap and concluded that inequality is one major factor in holding back the economy. S&P reduced its projections for annual growth from 2.8% down to 2.5% due to widening inequality. Again, economists on Wall Street are telling us that extreme inequality is holding back the economy. Now, this next chart illustrates extraordinary rapid growth of annual wages for the top 1%, that's the line on the top. They grew 149%, while the wages at the bottom 90% just grew about 16% from 1979 to 2014. Today's discussion contrasts two very different views of the role of policy, one where policies concentrate the economic gains disproportionately among those at the top income bracket with the premise that these gains eventually trickle down, and another one which calls for public investment in training, infrastructure, and research in order to produce sustainable growth for everybody. The question before us is whether we will choose to pursue prosperity economics or austerity economics. Will we adopt policies that advance the middle-class jobs or perpetuate poverty-wage jobs? Will our labor policies and workforce investments concentrate the wealth in the hands of the top 1%, or will our policies grow and strengthen working families? The choices we make here in Congress, especially those we make in this committee, will shape that answer. The President's budget recognizes this reality and proposes a way to make investments our country needs by responsibly ending sequestration. Democrats and many Republicans agree that the mindless cuts mandated by sequestration are bad policy and do not benefit our economy or our national defense. But instead of addressing the situation head-on, the debate is focused on extending tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans while robbing the country of resources needed for education, infrastructure, and research. We saw this late last year when we passed another $600 and some billion tax cut, which drained resources from investments. And that passed the House. I don't think it's passed the Senate, and hopefully it won't. The Department of Labor's priorities and budget requests offer proposals to narrow the extreme and growing income inequality in our country while closing the pay gap between men and women. The fact is that concrete steps must be taken to move the nation in the right direction. One step is to adopt policies that pay workers a living wage and enable them to balance family and work. The raise in the minimum wage is long overdue. If the minimum wage had been adjusted for inflation over the years, it would have increased to over $18 an hour by now, but of course it has not kept up with productivity. Another step to take is to protect retirees and their hard-earned retirement savings to ensure that our fellow Americans can rest with dignity after a lifetime of hard work. Likewise, protections are needed to keep workers safe and healthy on the job. We must also adjust the overtime threshold, the guaranteed access to paid sick leave, and to ensure that federal workers and contractors are paid fairly by requiring contractors to provide pay stubs so that you know exactly what you've been paid, and that would significantly reduce wage theft. All of these are long overdue, and I applaud the administration for proposing rules in these areas. Economic growth and strong regulatory protections are not mutually exclusive. After all, the absence of regulation allowed Wall Street to run amok and caused a credit freeze in 2008 that destroyed hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. Finally, I know that the Secretary remains focused on preparing the nation's workforce on jobs of today, more importantly, for the jobs of tomorrow. These priorities are reflected in the Department's budget, which focuses funding on summer and year-round jobs, opportunities for disconnected youth, apprenticeships, and programs that expand training for in-demand jobs. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to hearing more about your department's agenda and your vision for a more prosperous economy and a more prosperous middle class. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished witness. Secretary, we're delighted to have you back. The Honorable Thomas C. Perez serves as the U.S. Secretary of Labor and is no stranger to this committee and to hearings here. We're very glad to have you back. He has a distinguished career, and I could go through a list of other positions: Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, Secretary of Maryland's Department of Labor, and so on. He's got a lot of experience. He is our Secretary, and we're delighted to have him here today. Now, Mr. Secretary, I've got to ask you to stand and raise your right hand. That'll make that chair slide back. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record reflect the Secretary answered in the affirmative again. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me remind you of our lighting system. I can't remember, I don't think we were in this room the last time that you were here.
Very different.
New digs here. The system is still the same. We've got the old red, yellow, green light system. It should be right there in front of you. Take the time that you need for your testimony. I won't gavel you down while you're giving your testimony, but please be mindful that we're going to have a lot of members who want to engage in the discussion. And then again, I will remind my colleagues that members will have 5 minutes unless I have to shorten the time as the time goes on. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, can I correct my testimony? I was just advised that the $600 and some billion tax cut was approved by the Senate and went into law, so there.
It stands corrected. So again, to my colleagues, please don't push the limits on time. As we saw yesterday, we can run out of time very quickly, and I'd rather not get down to 3 minutes per member. So be mindful of the time as you go forward, and try not to put the Secretary in the position of having 10 seconds to give a 5-minute answer. And maybe the only time, Mr. Secretary, that you hear me drop the gavel is if you're in the process of understandably giving a 5-minute answer to a second where you're given 10 seconds. With that understanding, we're ready to go. Mr. Secretary, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. And I want to start out by saying thank you for your distinguished service. I was very saddened when I learned of your decision to retire, and it's been an honor and pleasure working with you. Thank you for your service to the nation, and thank you for your service to your constituents. It's really been a pleasure working with you. It's been a pleasure working with everyone on this committee. We've done a lot of different things, whether it's Mr. Guthrie and ESOPs, Congresswoman Fox and apprenticeship, Ranking Member Scott and minimum wage, so many others. Congressman Courtney, and so many issues. So I want to say thank you. We don't always agree on everything, as this hearing, I suspect, may illustrate, but we do agree on a lot, and we will always search for that common ground. And as we prepare for the final 10 months of this administration, I do think it's important to reflect on where we've been, where we are, and where we need to go. President Obama inherited an economy in free fall. In the 3 months before he took office, the economy hemorrhaged roughly 2.3 million jobs. 7 years later, we've successfully climbed out of the worst economic crisis in generations, although there's undeniable unfinished business. We're now in the middle of the longest streak of private sector job growth on record, 6 straight years to the tune of 14.3 million new jobs. Unemployment is down from 10% to now 4.9%. Auto sales reached a record high last year. And again, as I mentioned, while we still have the unfinished business of ensuring shared prosperity for everyone, we've made undeniable progress. And I'm proud of the role that the department has played in this progress, because our work is critical to fortifying the basic pillars of the middle class: an education and training that allows you to move up the ladder of success, health care that's affordable and accessible, a fair pays day for a hard day's work, a roof over your head and a mortgage that won't go underwater, and the opportunity to save for a secure and dignified retirement. These pillars took a beating during the Great Recession, but I've never felt more confident in the resilience of our economy, our workers, and our businesses. And the Labor Department's work continues to help sustain this recovery while addressing the unfinished business of ensuring shared prosperity. For instance, between 2008 and 2014, our employment and training program served an average of 14 million Americans a year, helping more than half of them get new jobs. And the new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act will make us that much more effective. I'm very grateful to the members of the committee, to the bipartisan support, the overwhelming bipartisan support in passing this new law. And we continue to work with our state and federal and local partners toward full implementation. We owe as the blueprint for a modernized, streamlined workforce system that will better serve the job seekers and employers alike. I often refer to this as our Eisenhower moment. Just as we built the interstate highway system in the mid-20th century, today we're building the 21st century skills superhighway. It's got dedicated lanes for different populations, helping everyone reach their ultimate destination, a middle-class job and prosperity for workers, businesses, and communities alike. One of the on-ramps on that superhighway is apprenticeship. Every public dollar invested in this Earn While You Learn model provides a $27 return. That was one of our recent studies. And that's why the President has challenged us to double the number of apprentices in the coming years while transforming the system by diversifying and expanding to new industries. Last year, we made the largest ever federal investment in apprenticeship, $175 million in grants, and I appreciate the $90 million that Congress appropriated for this fiscal year. We're making sure apprenticeship is accessible in every community, every zip code. And our mission doesn't just help people find good jobs, but make sure that these jobs pay a family-sustaining wage. That's why we continue to advocate for an increase in the minimum wage, strongly support the Scott Murray proposal, and will continue to work with state and local governments on this issue. We also continue to work on overtime, because overtime stands for the simple proposition that if you work extra, you should be paid extra. It's a basic principle. And the final rule that we have worked on and had a very inclusive process about was submitted to OMB earlier this week for review. Our Wage and Hour Division has also cracked down on wage theft that threatens the livelihoods of so many people. Since 2009, the Wage and Hour Division has been able to secure back wages totaling $1.6 billion for 1.7 million workers. I believe it's a false choice to suggest that we can either have economic growth or workplace safety. We can and must have both. And this administration has been vigilant about making sure that workers don't have to risk injury or illness in order to earn their paycheck, while working closely with employers on this matter. In the 1930s, Francis Perkins identified silica dust as a dangerous and deadly hazard and called on employers to protect those workers. Finally, 80 years later, our OSHA office is close to issuing an updated rule that will significantly reduce workers' exposure and save lives. Our mine safety office has done remarkable work over the last 7 years. Thanks in part to their efforts, there were fewer mining fatalities in 2015 than any other year in history. We continue to implement the historic coal dust rule, and since it took effect, about 99% of the dust samples taken by MSHA and coal operators are in compliance. We are also charged with empowering workers not just during their career, but after their careers are over. And we've done a lot of work through our Employee Benefit Security Administration toward this end. One such issue is the proposed conflict of interest rule, which I suspect we might discuss here today, just a guess. And it's based on a common sense principle. If you want to give advice, you have to put your client's best interest first. As Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, said, I learned early on in the business that when you put your customers first, it's great for your customers and it's great for business. And so we will continue to work on that rule. I've had an opportunity in this job to make a lot of house calls, and those house calls have inspired me to continue to do my work. I met with a woman in Connecticut named Catherine Hackett. She'd been out of the workforce for such a long time, but for the grace of God, could have gone any of us. But as a result of the leadership of her member of Congress, the work of Match.com, otherwise known as the Department of Labor, our state and local partners, she now has a full-time job again, and she is thriving. I've seen so many inspiring stories like Catherine Hackett, but I've also visited people whose boat hasn't yet been lifted by this rising tide. People like the janitor in Houston, Astroberta, who's struggling to get on with less than $9 an hour. The fast food worker in Detroit who was sleeping in her car with 3 kids the night before I met her because she'd been evicted from her apartment. Alan White, the person I met again last week in my hometown of Buffalo, whose life is being very much inhibited by silicosis. These challenges that they confront keep me up at night, and the opportunity to help them and to create shared prosperity in an economy that works for everyone, to work with you whenever possible, this is what gets me out of bed with a hop in my step every morning, aside from the fact that I had a knee replacement, so I have a bit of a hop from time to time. We have 310 days left till the weekend, and I want to make sure that we don't simply count the days, but we make every day count, and I look forward to working with you toward that end, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your time, thank you for your courtesy, and thank you for your long and distinguished career of service.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony and your kind words about my retirement. Find that when you announce you're retiring, you get friends everywhere. It's just, I don't understand exactly what that means. Let me start, Mr. Secretary, by thanking you for your support and your hard work as we push through the Bipartisan Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act in the closing days, literally, of 2014 in December. I think that that action has helped secure the retirement of millions of workers and retirees, and you and the rest of the administration were instrumental in its passage. Our work is far from over. As the administration noted in its budget, further reform is needed to strengthen the finances of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which you chair. We share the administration's commitment to ensuring that this important federal backstop is well funded, but we need to do even more. So I'm committed to working with you and Treasury Secretary Lew, Ranking Member Scott, and others to reach an agreement on a package of reforms that will shore up PBGC and give employers and workers options for new benefit plans such as composite plans. So I'm committing to you and to my colleagues here that I'm fully engaged in trying to get this done, but time is growing short. So I'm asking for your commitment, sir, to working with us to try to get these reforms finished this year.
You know, we've had a number of conversations both with you and with Leader Pelosi and over at the White House and at the PBGC, and we have a team of folks that have already been engaged bicamerally and bipartisan way to address these issues. As you know, the multi-employer pension system at the PBGC is in the red in a big way, and we recognize that there are many tough decisions to be made, and we commit to building a big table so that we can have and continue the dialogue that we have been undertaking.
And I appreciate that, and I absolutely take you at your word. Just a reminder to all of us, this has to be a bipartisan effort, and we have to get with the program, as they say, because we're running out of time and be ashamed to start all over. On another subject, we are looking at the joint employer policies and discussions surrounding them that are coming from your department and from other agencies. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has filed an amicus brief with the National Labor Relations Board and the Browning-Ferris, supporting a broader definition of joint employer, wage and hour, and your department is engaged. I I think the actions within your department, as well as those taken by the NLRB and the EOC, demonstrate that the administration is aggressively trying to expand the definition of joint employer across all labor and employment laws, and frankly, without concern for the negative impact on the franchise model that has served us so well. I'm greatly concerned by the likely impact of these efforts on workers and their employers, particularly smaller businesses. Can you explain DOL's role in what seems to be the administration's concerted efforts to expand the definition of joint employer?
I would respectfully disagree that we've been attempting to expand the definition of joint employer. We have been applying joint employer both in the OSHA context and in the wage and hour context when the facts so support. So for instance, we had a case involving a gentleman named Daquan Davis. He completed his Job Corps program. He got a job at Bacardi Rum down in Florida. His first day on the job was his only day on the job because he was so ill-trained by the company. There was a job service through which he got the job. He was so ill-trained that he literally died on the job day one. And our investigation in that case showed that both the staffing agency that placed him and the company that where he died on their assembly line that day bore responsibility. So those were the facts in that case.
Well, I'm sure that
we follow the facts and where the facts lead us.
That is it's kind of a scary story, and one we don't like to hear. But I can tell you that there is a great deal of concern in the business community by franchisors and franchisees that it looks like that there is an expansion of that definition. I understand the Wage and Hour Division requested a 22% increase in its budget, the largest increase within your department, and proposes to hire 300 full-time employees to develop, quote, corporate and enterprise-wide, close quote, enforcement. What is meant by corporate and enterprise-wide enforcement?
Well, the Wage and Hour Division has a very critical mandate, and their mandate is to make sure that when you work a full day, you get paid a full day wage. We had a study conducted recently just in 2 states that showed that the amount of wage theft was $1 billion alone in the state of California and New York. Wage theft is a huge problem in this country. The Wage and Hour Division has worked very carefully, and by the way, very closely with employers, because we get complaints frequently from employers about the fact that other employers are misclassifying employees, and it creates an unlevel playing field because they can't compete for contracts when you have someone else cheating, which is why we have memoranda of understanding with 29 states ranging from Utah, Texas, Arizona, to Massachusetts as well. So I believe firmly in the work of the Wage and Hour Division, and we work very collaboratively, and when necessary, we use our enforcement
my
tools.
time has expired, and I've got to gavel you and me down at the same time. I'm just re-expressing my concern about this increase in the number of employees, and if the Wage and Hour might be contemplating an expansion of the enforcement of the franchisor-franchisee relationship. Those concerns remain. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it. Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You mentioned wage theft. How much of that is due to the fact that many employees don't even get a pay stub, so they can't calculate what their wages would be?
Well, that's certainly part of the challenge in wage theft, Congressman Scott. And I know when we commissioned that study, a lot of folks who are victims of wage theft don't even know they're victims of wage theft because they have a difficulty figuring that out. And we have 135 million workers, 7 million employers. And so trying to do the work in the Wage and Hour Division with the complement of resources we have creates challenges, undeniably.
Thank you. You'd mentioned the conflict of interest rule. One of the problems in the discussion is that the rule isn't final. When can we expect a final rule?
Well, the rule was sent to OMB, I believe, 6 weeks ago or something like that. I may be off by a couple weeks, and so we hope to bring it to conclusion in as soon as OMB completes their review, but sometime in the near future.
And an alternative was suggested, one introduced by the gentleman from Tennessee. Are you familiar with that proposal?
Yes, I am.
And why is it insufficient?
Well, we have reproposed. The proposal right now is a reproposal because we introduced a regulation in 2010, and then we withdrew that regulation. And I made a commitment when I was nominated to take this slowly, build a big inclusive tent, listen to people like Congressman Guthrie, who had a concern about ESOPs. So we took ESOPs out of our proposal, and we've moved forward in a very deliberate way, in a very inclusive way. And the problem right now that I have is we're 6 years into this, and our goal here, our North Star, is to ensure that we have an enforceable best interest standard. And meaning no disrespect to Congressman Rowe, for whom I have great respect, and others, I actually think that those bills actually move the status quo backward in material respects. And so we need to move forward, and we've had a very inclusive process. Every time someone has said, can you talk to one of my constituents, we've done it, and sometimes we've done it 2, 3, 4 times, because every time I talk to someone, I learn more, and we become more informed.
One of the groups that has the trouble getting jobs would be ex-offenders. What does your budget do to help ex-offenders find jobs?
We have a remarkable, one of the most exciting things about this job is really the bipartisan coordination we've done through our so-called Rexo grants, which have enabled us to provide remarkable opportunities. And in addition to that, we've really been at the tip of the spear on innovation. So we have worked with cities and counties to put one-stop centers in city and county jails. We did that in Montgomery County when I was in local government, and if I brought the warden here today, he would tell you that that made his jail safer, that enabled people to get more jobs, and the most important thing we could do, or one of the most important things we can do if we want to reduce recidivism, is make sure that when people come out of jail, they have the skills to compete for the jobs of tomorrow. And so I'm very excited about what we're doing. We work very closely with the Department of Justice as well, so that we can synergize our grant making, and we work with state and local partners, our nonprofit partners, our faith leaders as well, and we're making tremendous progress, and our budget request does include funding to continue to ramp that up.
Thank you. Can you say something about the adequacy of criminal penalties and mine safety violations, particularly when someone knowingly violates safety regulations, placing workers at risk of serious injury or death?
Well, those issues are the case both in the OSHA context and in the MSHA context. We had a horrific case in the OSHA context where a worker was literally dissolved to death, and as a result of that, there was a spill into the nearby lake. Our fine was something like $50,000, and then the EPA fine for killing the fish was in the millions. So the fish had more protection than the people. And in the mine safety context, the Upper Big Branch disaster is probably a notable example of chronic negligence all the way up at the top of the organization. And the reason that happens in cases like that is because when you perceive that there's no more than a slap in the wrist, then you tend to violate the law. If you have a speed limit sign that says 45 miles an hour, parentheses, self-enforcement, you're going to have a lot of speeding.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and
Good to see you.
welcome, Secretary Perez. I'm extremely concerned by the department's repeated delays in issuing regulations implementing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. You've been very complimentary about it. I appreciate the chairman's positive comments. The most recent delay of final regulations even more concerning, given the department will be reviewing and approving state plans prior to the issuance of final regulations. This includes negotiating levels of performance, which will be used to determine whether a state meets the requirements of the law. It's outrageous the department would hold states accountable to rules that have not been finalized. Given final regulations have yet to be issued, what basis is the department using to approve state plans?
Congresswoman Fox, as I mentioned to you on our phone call, we've been working very, very closely with states since the passage of WIOA, and I'm very excited about the work that we have done. We did literally 41 pieces of operating guidance, 28 technical assistance webinars, and your teams have been involved in every step of the way. The majority of WIOA is already in place. It was implemented a year ago. What remains are the accountability mechanisms, and the good news there is because of the work that we've been doing together with states and with the help of your teams, you look at the number of states, over 40 states have WIOA compliant state boards. Roughly half the states have already prepared draft plans. And most importantly, the stovepipe implosion that WIOA contemplates, making sure that we build one big sandbox of opportunity. So it's not the education department one way and the workforce people another way. Making sure we're working together. We've already issued state plan guidance that tells states what they need to do, and we talk to them literally on a weekly basis. And so I'm very excited about the progress, and I'm very appreciative because the regulations were over 1,800 pages, and they took a lot of work, and nobody took any Thanksgiving or Christmas holidays among our career teams. And frankly, I think WIOA is a good news story because we're moving forward together. There's a ton of excitement in the field, and I'm very proud of the work that we're doing, and we look forward to continuing that collaboration with you and others.
But Mr. Secretary, these things are being negotiated one-to-one by you, and I think that exhibits a cavalier attitude on the part of the department regarding the Administrative Procedures Act and the requirements of the law relating to rulemaking. You know, Congress has prescribed a specific process for the promulgation of regulations to allow for public comment and congressional oversight. The de facto issuance of final regulations through the approval of state plans circumvents this process by making the rules effective before providing Congress with the opportunity to review them. And even in your own comments today, and I've made a list of things you all do: executive orders, guidance letters, program letters, notices, administrators' interpretation clarifying, memorandum, directives, reporting requirements, enforcement guidance documents, corporate and enterprise enforcement, technical assistance webinars you just mentioned. So all of this goes around the rulemaking process, which we think you should be doing, and it appears to us that you don't want to publish official rules so that the public can comment on them. You do new programs. The chairman mentioned new programs that we see as a way to get around this. And this morning, I had a meeting with a manufacturer from my district, and he's on one of the boards, and he said getting change on those local boards is like pushing a string, that they cannot get the changes because they don't have the guidelines and the accountability measures. That's what we want to see. What are the accountability measures for these programs?
With all due respect, we've been anything but cavalier. We've been working relentlessly with states. And as someone who ran a state agency, one of the things that always disappointed me was when the federal government would issue guidance or regulations without including us. And so my direction to the team, and remember, Congress debated the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act for 10 years. And then after that 10-year discussion gave us 1 year to do everything that we needed to do. And we built a very inclusive table. The state plan guidance that I'm referring to was made public, and we took public comment on it. Our final rules will be out in June. And we have been working very closely with your teams, with others, and we've had a remarkably constructive relationship. There's no effort, intent to do anything other than make sure we implement every aspect of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act to the fullest extent possible. And the good news, Congresswoman, is we are making tremendous progress. We're building that skills superhighway. We're building an ecosystem where we, for the first time in states across this country, you have the folks who administer TANF are talking to the folks who do education, are talking to the folks who do the workforce. And you see the number of states who are coming in with those unified plans. That's exactly what you wanted, and that's a good thing.
Thank you,
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony and your, just in my opinion, amazing service over the last couple of years. I appreciate your A shout out to Catherine Hackett from East Haddam, Connecticut, who is really kind of an iconic story of the Great Recession, who, again, worked her whole life, raised two great sons who are officers in the U.S. military, and unfortunately lost her job and was really struggling. The outreach, as you point out, in terms of helping her find right connection, as well as supportive employment programs, which kind of gave the employer that extra boost to get her into back into the workforce, which is now totally withered away, and she is now employed full-time, doing a great job as a business manager at an orthopedic office, which maybe your knee could, get some consultation there if you need it, if you're in the territory.
I'm taking notes.
Okay. Again, I just want to follow up on the last round of questioning, which is that the WOEA Act, which, again, I give Chairman Klein all the credit in the world for moving a bill a law that had not been changed since the Clinton administration and modernizing the structure and the focus, has been in total hitting all cylinders in Connecticut. Down the hall right now, the Secretary of the Navy is talking about the fact that in the last 7 years, the Navy has put under contract 84 ships and submarines. The prior 8 years, the prior administration, it was only 41. So you can imagine what that means in terms of the industrial base, whether it's Connecticut or Virginia or California, is that we have really had to move fast in terms of metal trades, engineering, and design. In January, Electric Boat announced 1,500 hires this year to again, accommodate that demand signal from the Navy, and it's been all hands on deck, which the WEA Act and the Workforce Board is today, producing results, and which wouldn't have been the case without passage of that law and without, by the way, the omnibus, which has given the workforce innovation funds that now are combining community colleges, tech schools, and the employer, who are now working together to fill this huge workforce need. I mean, if you go online today, there's probably about 300 or 400 job openings right now as we're sitting here in this room. That's just for the shipyard. If you go, there are 470 suppliers in Connecticut, and there's thousands across the country. They were in town just a couple of weeks ago, the Submarine Industrial Base Coalition. So the timing of this new mechanism, as well as the resources out there for, again, just take one little sector, which is shipbuilding, a much neglected part of the U.S. economy. You guys are at the center of trying to solve that problem, and I'm sure that's happening in other parts of the country as well as eastern Connecticut, and I don't know if you want to, again, comment further.
Well, I remember my trip vividly, Congressman Courtney, to Electric Boat. I remember my trip with Congresswoman Fox to a number of locations in her district. I remember my trip with Chairman Rogers to West Virginia, and I met a bunch of displaced coal miners who were now working in coding at a place called BitSource. And their motto was "From coal to code." And what all of those three visits have in common is that the workforce system is being a remarkable engine of partnership, innovation, and success. We have 5.6 million job openings right now. And every conversation I have with employers is a good conversation. I'm bullish about the future. I want to grow my business, and one of my biggest challenges is making sure I have the skilled workforce to compete. One of the best ways to address wage stagnation is to upskill people. And that's why what I see happening across this country in red, blue, that's totally irrelevant to this conversation, is very exciting. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that you've supported in apprenticeship, because that's another way. Apprenticeship is the other college, except without the debt. And so there's so much we can do to make sure we're building this skills superhighway so that we can help people who want to punch their ticket in the middle class and employers who want to grow their business. And this is really going to be one of your legacies, Mr. Chairman, as the chair of the committee, is building that skills superhighway.
Thank you. And again, it's I talked about maritime. I mean, the same is true in aerospace. Both in the civilian and military side, we are going to have huge workforce needs out there, and there really is just no other mechanism other than WOEA and the Department of Labor to help employers fill those really good-paying, high-value positions. With that, I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank
Morning,
you,
sir.
Secretary,
Good to
for
see you.
being here. I'm going to start by just bringing over some facts that today 20% of Latinos have greater than $10,000 in retirement, and 29% of Americans, according to GAO, have nothing for retirement. Some studies show as much as 50% of people have no retirement savings. So I think, and 75% of all African Americans are in the bottom quartile of retirement. And I don't believe that your rulemaking that you're doing on fiduciary and other things, I don't think your intention is to decrease financial advice that low-income investors get. I don't believe that. I don't think you believe that. But there are some facts out there that we cannot ignore now. And for many years, you've stated that your goal was promoting the Department's fiduciary rulemaking was to ensure that all retirement advisors act in the best interest of savers when giving investment advice. And dating back to our first hearing in July of 2011, I publicly agreed with that goal. Today, I still agree with it. In fact, Republicans and Democrats have long agreed we need to look at ways to strengthen protections for those saving for retirement. That's why I'm disappointed that the Department publicly opposed the bipartisan legislation, Affordable Retirement Advice and Protection Act, and its companion, the Savers Act. This legislation would make the stated goal of best interest standards a reality without prohibiting advice, the so-called best interest contract exemption. DOL proposal will make it harder for working families to save and plan for retirement. We have no indication that the final rule will be any different. That's why Congress should act in a bipartisan way. And let me just give you a couple of things. The Washington Post just said, I think it was yesterday in an editorial, supporting the fiduciary rule as having more pluses than minuses. I think they would definitely support my bill, that the exemption's unworkable. The investment industry's strongest point that a proposed exemption the administration offered to placate opponents is so vague and unworkable that few, if any, companies would take advantage of it. And a study just published from the UK, I think this week, said we believe, and this is in the UK, that the new regulation they passed in 2013 has brought about positive step changes in the quality of advice available to those with larger amounts to invest, which is what we've said all along. However, steps need to be taken to make the provision of advice and guidance to the mass market more cost-effective. And at present, this high standard of advice is primarily accessible and affordable only to the more affluent in society. Would you now reconsider with this new information your opposition to our common sense legislation?
Well, Mr. Congressman, let me say a few things. Number one, in our Ozzie and Harriet universe, this issue was irrelevant because people worked 30 years, they had a defined benefit plan, and at the end of that 30 years, they had a pen, a party, and a pension. Today, in the world of the $11 or $12 trillion world of IRAs and 401ks, people are responsible for their own decisions. And as Jack Bogle, as I noted before, said, when you put your customers' interests first, it's good for your customers and it's good for business. You said something that I wanted to correct, which is that you indicated that there's no indication that the final rule will be different. When we withdrew our first rule, we undertook a series of meetings and listening sessions. Our first rule, for instance, had a provision pertaining to ESOPs. We heard a lot about that. We heard a lot of concerns. And as a result of that, our NPRM took that out. I've said repeatedly and publicly, our North Star is an enforceable best interest standard.
The best interest contract exemption. I appreciate that change in the rule, but what about the best interest contract exemption, which seems to be unworkable?
Well, again, our North Star is an enforceable best interest rule. Best interest standard. We heard from a number of people who said there's a more linear path to that. Our response, show us the path. And that's why we got 300,000, I think, comments. We've read every single one of them. And I look forward at the conclusion of our process to briefing you and explaining to you, here was the proposed rule, here were the comments we got, here are the changes we've made. And when we reach the end of the process, I commit to you that we will do that with you and with anyone else who has an interest.
Well, I'm glad to hear the independent investment firm Morningstar recently estimated your proposal will cost $2.4 billion every year in compliance costs, which will be passed on to me, the retirement saver. Moreover, the Morningstar report also said that wealth management firms would no longer serve low-income savers currently holding up to $600 billion low-balance IRAs. The big chunk of that business will go to robo-advisors, which I think is a bad idea. But before my time's expired, I do want to say one thing and this is off of the fiduciary rule, but the most productive, I was in Beijing, China 2 years ago with the committee, 1.4 billion people live in China, and 1.4 billion people don't produce as many goods and services as the American worker does with 300 million people. The most productive worker in the world is the American worker, and we need to be telling our workers that more. They feel very beat down. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Mr. Sablan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you
Morning, good to see you again.
for being here, Mr. Secretary Perez. The Northern Mariana Islands, as you know, my district faces a different problem than much of America. We actually have too many jobs and not enough workers. And it's not as if people can get in their car and drive across this state line, county line, and be there to occupy these jobs. Well, not enough U.S. workers, so we have to bring in about 10,000 workers from Asia to support our economy. 2 years ago, Mr. Secretary, we extended a program that allowed those foreign workers into the Northern Marianas, and I think that was the right decision. Personally, I preferred that we didn't need these workers, that we had enough, but I thank you for doing so because I also know that you probably had the same personal preference as I do. But you based your decision on a study by economists and others in your department. You concluded that there were not enough U.S. workers to serve the economy in 2014 and would not be for at least another 5 years. I have 3 questions, actually. First, can you tell us what your department is doing now to help develop more U.S. workers in the Marianas, either through training people already there or by making the job opportunity known to U.S. workers elsewhere in America?
Sure. Over the last 4 fiscal years, the CNMI has received roughly $6 million in grants from the department, and those grants are designed to do for the workforce system there what we're doing elsewhere across the United States. We look forward to working more. There are a number of competitive grant opportunities, and I'm more than willing to have our ETA staff talk to you about competitive grant opportunities that we have a cadre of career staff that reviews those requests or the submissions. And we also visited the CNMI in, I think, 2015 or 2016 to provide technical assistance. And so we want to make sure that we do everything in our power to help.
We appreciate and we need all the help you can give us, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. My second question is, in extending the foreign worker program, you requested that the Commonwealth government update your department every year about its, quote, efforts to locate, educate, train, or otherwise prepare U.S. citizens to work in the Marianas. These updates were so your department could be prepared to decide about extending the foreign worker program beyond 2019. The law no longer allows you to extend the program, I understand that. But are you still expecting to get the updates, Mr. Secretary?
Oh, we certainly, I mean, our North Star here is U.S. workers. Anything we can do to help U.S. workers is what we try to do. We recognize that there weren't enough, and that's why we did we granted the
Extension.
transition till 2019.
Yeah.
And those reports are very critical in enabling us to make that judgment about the North Star that I referred to. How are things going with the development?
But are you expecting to get the updates now that the 2019 date is no longer flexible?
Yes, we're expecting to get the updates.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And so now here's my final question, Mr. Secretary. And I know the Commonwealth government has been working on a study of what our labor needs will be going forward. They are looking at development plans, propose the demographics, the skills that we currently have. And I suppose they will use this information to update you, but it is also for their own planning purposes. And it must be very similar to the analysis that your department did prior to advising you to extend the foreign worker program. And so my question is whether you would be willing to share with the Marianas Commonwealth government the technical expertise you have in your department to do this work. That's so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, as they say. Is it good? Maybe a yes? Or
Sure, we would look forward to working with you in any way that we can to help build a strong economy in the island.
I appreciate that, and whatever you could do to help us would be very, the kind of assessment of the labor needs and training efforts would certainly be helpful to us here in Congress, even in assessing whether to extend the foreign worker program, the CW as we call it, which is something I think we would have to look at probably in the next Congress. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your service to our country. And now, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr.
Morning,
Secretary.
morning, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again.
You're a long way off down there.
It does look a few time zones away, I must admit.
This is especially looking through Mr. Burns' head here. Glad to see you.
Well, he has hair, so unlike me, so that might make it a little harder.
I'm jealous. Mr. Secretary, there are many small retail and restaurant businesses who employ younger managers who currently earn salaries that are less than $50,000 per year. I'm not concerned that we would increase the overtime. It was probably needed, the wage, but $50,000 causes me concern because as I look at some of the reports, over 50% of retail managers are female, and many are working mothers who appreciate the flexibility and other things that come with salaried status, the resume builder, the experience opportunities, as well as using their skills, allowing these managers highly valued quality time with their children. The pending overtime regulation would require that many of these managers be converted to hourly non-exempt status, which effectively eliminates much of the flexibility working women, and may I add, men, value. Is this outcome the outcome that the President and your department desires in regards to the flexibility in particular, as it would impact managers who are currently exempt and accustomed to having greater flexibility than their non-exempt counterparts?
Sure. Because of the status of the reg, there are limits to what I can say, but what I can say is this. Nothing requires hourly status. You can be salaried and get overtime. There's a number of ways to do it. And the process that we undertook was to make sure we sat down and listened to, and before we even did the formal notice and comment, I personally participated in a number of meetings with retailers, large, small, in between, and I asked them, among other things, what'd you do back in 2004 when the Bush administration changed the rules so that we could learn from that? And that was very instructive. I met a person who worked 70 hours a week, and I remember somebody asked, when was the last time you had a vacation? And they said, vacation? Vacation's when I only work 40 hours a week. And what we learned is there's a lot of folks who are working, 20, 30 hours, and frankly, those hours are effectively not compensated because of some of the situations.
But certainly, you also heard testimonies I've heard all across my district of people who understand that. That's part of being salaried. There are also some we've had in front of us who were assistant managers who during times worked less than 8 hours a day based upon the flexibility that they had, and sometimes 80 hours a week they would work, yes. But the options that they had were very important to them. And like I said, if we'd gone from 23,000 to, say, if we kept the same formula that was used to bring it to 23,000, we probably would have been at 36,000. I think that might have been more justifiable. But to move it up to 50 plus is a real challenge to the small businesses, but more importantly, I think to these growing managers that want this opportunity and the flexibility that gives, because sometimes that flexibility is far more important than even the salary level.
Well, one thing, I would commit to you is when the final rule is published, we will have our team come to you and anyone else to explain what it means, to explain what the options are, to explain the flexibilities that exist.
Well, we look forward to that, but I also don't look forward to the potential fallout if it goes the way that we have heard. Silica, let's move on here. Mr. Secretary, quoting from your testimony, a new silica permissible exposure limit, PEL, is expected to be issued shortly. In context with the fact that silicosis is down significantly with present standards, except for a few unique, and I mean unique, hotspots in underground mining, in context with the present PEL, Are you confident the Pell and the engineering controls mandated by the regulation will meet OSHA's legal requirement to promulgate a rule that is technologically and economically feasible? And again, in context with the fact, as I understand it from last testimony, we don't have measuring devices yet that can measure the new standard. Has that changed?
Well, again, this has been a 20-year process of outreach, talking to NIOSH, understanding the science. And when we did the proposed rulemaking, we had, I think, over a week of hearings, and we heard from folks in the industry, we heard from scientists, we heard from all the stakeholders about what we need to do. And we heard from folks like Alan White, who are living with silicosis. We heard from folks like Mr. Ward from Michigan, whom I met recently, whose father died at the age of 39 from silicosis. And so we have built, as always, a very inclusive process, and I'm very proud of that. And one of the things we heard with frequency was you need to make sure that standards are flexible so that they can be achievable. We had this conversation in coal dust, and we heard a lot of the same issues.
Sorry, the gentleman's
99% of the tests now.
Gentleman's
have
time, both
been within
gentlemen's
the new
time
level.
has expired. Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank
Morning.
you for joining us, Secretary Perez. Last March, the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, Dr. David Michaels, wrote about a woman from Massachusetts named Guadalupe Gonzalez. She was injured on the job after 3 surgeries, unable to return to her former work, and today she earned 60% of the former salary that she had. And she is only one of the estimated 3 million Americans who will suffer both physically and economically due to on-the-job injuries. And last June, OSHA released a report examining the plight of injured workers and detailing how changes in state-based workers' compensation insurance programs have made it increasingly difficult for injured workers to receive full compensation, with employers providing only 20% of the overall financial costs of workplace injuries. When employers are no longer responsible for covering the full costs of these workplace injuries, what effect are you seeing overall on worker safety?
Well, one of the basic rights that we have in any workplace is the right to be safe and sound. And what we have seen in frankly, alarming trend data across the country, and the example you cite, I wish were an outlier, but it's not, is that one of the emerging pathways to poverty in America is a workplace injury. And I've spent a lot of time on this issue, and I appreciate the letter that you and others sent to us, I think, last in 2015 about this issue. And there's frankly a troubling trend in states across the country to either privatize workers' comp or dramatically reduce the benefits, and that's not fair. It's part of the safety net. If, God forbid, you get hurt on the job, that shouldn't put you into poverty. And by the way, one of the impacts that we see is that then there are increased applications in Social Security disability insurance. So the federal government is indeed having to bear the burden for these state efforts. And so that's why we have been assessing steps that we can take moving forward, understanding that a lot of these laws are really at a state level. But I look forward to continuing this conversation because it's a sleeper issue that needs to be given light, because it's unfair that people walk to work, go into work in the morning, and then begin that pathway to poverty that day when they have that injury.
Thank you, and we look forward to continuing working with you on that. And I also want to thank you for your leadership around the issue of paid leave. And in particular, the Paid Leave Analysis Grant Initiative that you undertook and the Paid Leave Partnership Initiative proposal that is in the 2017 budget. We remain one of the few industrialized nations that does not provide robust paid leave for our workers. with only 12% of private sector workers get parental and family leave from their employers, and only 4 in 10 have access to paid medical leave at work. I know that I hear when I go home that there is a cost to not providing paid leave. What are you hearing from the business community when they are making the case for paid leave?
Well, the cost of doing nothing is indeed significant, and you correctly point out that we're the only industrialized nation on the planet without a universal federal paid leave law. And regrettably, we're the only industrialized nation on the planet where this issue has become partisan. It's not partisan anywhere else in the world, and that is unfortunate. And when you and I'm thinking about the employer I met in Vermont. He provides paid leave. I did a roundtable with the Chamber of Commerce when I was up there talking about paid leave. He provides paid leave because he understands that it's a retention tool. It's the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. He has a lot of dual career couples. And when someone's sick and the other couple's employer doesn't have leave, guess who takes the day off? His employees. That's not fair to him. We need a level playing field, and we shouldn't have a race to the bottom. And for those who say our labor force participation rate is going down, we need to take steps to go up. The most important piece of public policy that we could undertake to increase labor force participation is a federal paid leave law. That would enable us to be at the same level of female labor force participation as Canada. We were equal to them in 2000. We're 8 points behind them now. If we had kept pace, we'd have 5.5 million more women in the workplace.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Salmon.
Thank you, Secretary
Morning, sir.
Perez. Welcome. Thank you for
Thank you for your distinguished service as well, by the way.
extinguished is more probably where we're at right now. But I wanted to just address a couple things. First, I think it's pretty widely accepted that one of the most respected small business advocates in the country is the NFIB. And small business really is the backbone, I think, of America's economy right now. They've expressed some strong reservations about the overtime rule and said that it could adversely affect as much as 40% of small businesses. Are you factoring in their concerns into the final decision on this rule?
Absolutely is the short answer. And before we did our formal rulemaking process, we did informal rulemaking process. We did outreach.
Right.
Because I want to listen and learn. And we built a big table. We talked to businesses, large, small, and in between, about their experiences. We asked them about what happened in 2004 when the Bush administration put in place a new rule. How did you adjust? What do you think? And so we've gotten a lot of feedback both during the informal outreach process and during the formal notice and comment process from small business, and we appreciate that input.
I appreciate that. I know that one of their contentions is that the law of unintended consequences could end up forcing some of those small businesses to not hire salaried employees or not hire those positions. And one of the unintended consequences could be a loss of jobs. So I just hope that is all taken into consideration. The second thing I wanted to talk about, and I know it's already been addressed, but in my time in Congress, and I'm going on 10 years, I've never had a proposed rule that has sparked constituent outcry and ringing the phones and sending emails more than the proposed rule on the fiduciary rule. And it's a bipartisan response. Very, very concerned folks that are lower income investors, lower income portfolios, and I just want to make sure that again, the law of unintended consequences doesn't take place, and it makes it so that the cost of doing business for them when hiring a financial planner is exorbitant and puts it out of reach for the common people. I understand that when people have multi-million-dollar portfolios that they can afford that kind of a thing, and the costs associated with with this rule, but I've heard from folks on both sides of the aisle in a big way, and I just wanted to, share that with you, and I hope that that is something that you do take into consideration, because the last thing I think any of us would want to see is limited access for lower income, middle class people that really want to participate in investing through 401ks and IRAs and those kinds of things. So,
Well, I think we have a shared interest in making sure that everybody has access to retirement advice. And I have said and made the offer many times to folks, and I will make it again. At the end of our process, we look forward to explaining what we did, the changes that we made, and how we intend to proceed. And I also look forward to anyone who is interested to listen to folks who right now are fiduciaries. They're doing this. They have a big book of small businesses and small savers. And what they tell me repeatedly is, to all those businesses who say they're no longer going to serve small investors, give them my email, give them my phone number, because we've figured out how to do well and do good. And so I think it would be very helpful for folks to learn the lessons that they've learned, because their businesses are going gangbusters. And so I look forward to the continuing dialogue with you, Congressman.
thank you, Secretary Perez, and I'm going to do the unexpected and not wait for you to gavel me and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's indeed a pleasure to hear from you this morning about your department's priorities. I agree that this administration has done a lot to be proud of, and I'm hopeful we can maintain the momentum in the years to come. I was pleased to learn that DOL was moving forward with the rule to update the income threshold for overtime protections for salaried workers, and that the rule was sent to OMB just this week. In fact, many of my colleagues here today have joined me in sending a letter urging OMB to act promptly to review the rule and finalize it so we can begin helping millions of workers as soon as possible. As you know, Americans are working longer hours and are more productive, yet their wages are largely flat. It's crucial that they get a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. In 1975, 62% of salaried workers were eligible for overtime. Now only 8% of workers are eligible. Change is long overdue. Can you walk us through some of the repercussions of this new rule? In addition to raising wages for those workers who are newly eligible for overtime, won't it help redistribute hours to those who are underemployed?
Well, again, I can't get too specific on the details because we're in the rulemaking process, but the President directed us to modernize the overtime rule, because as I said before, overtime stands for the proposition that you work extra, you should be paid extra. And as a result of things that you correctly pointed out, we would talk to people time and time again who were working 60, 70 hours a week, making $25,000, $30,000 a year. So we ended up, again, doing a period of informal outreach that lasted roughly a year, followed by the formal notice and comment process, got about 300,000 comments, and have been carefully reviewing those. And again, there's a big discussion about stagnant wages in this country. And when I was growing up in Buffalo, New York, if my parents, if my friends of mine, their parents were a manager, that meant they were in the middle class. And there's a lot of folks who are managers doing important work who are frankly making the minimum wage, and I don't think that's fair.
Well, in a nutshell, this rule is about fair wages, but also work-life balance. Mr. Secretary, there's been a lot of discussion about the proposed rule's impact on job creation. The department has updated the salary level 7 times since the Fair Labor Standards Act became law in 1938. Can you talk generally about how industry has complied with these adjustments? Is there a history of significant job loss? Won't the rule also have a positive impact on the economy through increased consumer demand?
Well, what was interesting is there was a report by the National Retail Federation in connection with this proposal on overtime, and one of the things they noted was it may actually increase the number of jobs, and it's actually there's a simple reason for that. If you're working 60 hours a week and you're effectively working 20 of those 60 for free, and the overtime rule forces you to pay people now for those extra hours they're working, the response of some employers may be to hire more workers. So and again, that's the National Retail Federation. That wasn't a study from the Department of Labor. And so again, as we move forward here, we're taking care to listen to every single perspective and to understand what happened the 8 previous times. And we talked to a lot of people who were involved in and around after 2004 to say, well, how did you adjust to this? How did you adjust to that? Because we do care about the doctrine of unintended consequences as well as the direct consequences.
Great. Well, for the first time, the President's budget is requesting $50 million, the authorized amount for the Department's Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, or HVRP. Can you talk about the Department's efforts to help eliminate veterans' homelessness and how you hope to use the requested additional $12 million for the HVRP program?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your unwavering leadership in this area, and to thank everyone. This has been a bipartisan issue. I've had the privilege of serving as the chair of the Interagency Task Force to eliminate homelessness, and our focus on veterans employment, on eliminating veterans homelessness, has yielded remarkable dividends. And one of the ways we're doing it is by making sure we can get people a job. And the $50 million that you're referring to is going to enable us to serve over 22,000 veterans through the HVRP program. And the HVRP program has been studied. It's been shown to be incredibly successful, and we want to take it to scale. And we want to make sure that every single veteran who did so much for us, we got their back when they're home.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On point here.
Gentleman's time has expired. I need to let my colleagues know that I'm having to reduce the time to 4 minutes. The Secretary has a hard stop time at 12, so please try to stay within your time limits. And I think, Mr. Guthrie, you were the victim of this yesterday, so my apologies, but you're recognized.
Always 4 minutes. So
You're recognized.
And thanks, Mr. Secretary, and thanks
see you
for some of
again.
the comments you've made earlier about us working together on the fiduciary rule when ESOPs were involved, and I appreciate that because it has been a good professional working relationship. And I'll even say that I think created a friendship too as well, so I appreciate that very much. And before I get to my question, I know the issues that are really affecting this group of people aren't necessarily in your department, but I had United Mine Workers in this morning, and you mentioned the Ozzie and Harriet world, and they were describing the world that they were in. These guys are older, about 10,000 in Kentucky. A lot of them over 75 that did retire from the mines with, as they talked to me this morning, we thought cradle-to-grave health care that they were promised, and what's going on in the administration, what's going on in the economy, but the administration as well, not necessarily in your department, but I'll tell them I was meeting with you in a few minutes and just wanted to bring up our United Mine Workers and what's happened to the coal industry, because without the existing industries paying into their pension fund, it is, as they're going out of business, it's been difficult for them. But on ESOPs, I know when we met, we talked about unintended consequences and had a great discussion and how ESOPs, I know the ones in my district that you met with and just all over the country create wealth for people that work in those businesses. But we're concerned that people's retirement security is all in one basket. I mean, that is a concern as we move forward. So we want to make sure that it's not compromised, that ESOPs are moving forward and doing things correctly. And in the oversight, so the oversight's important. What I've been reported back, and not the ESOP that you met with, but others, just not necessarily in my district, is when the Department of Labor has gone into the ESOPs, and not just rare occurrences, but more common, that they've issued subpoenas before they even notified that there's been an investigation going on. And I'm one even here to members of Congress. I've talked to chairmen before about subpoena power of the federal government, that we have to be careful with it. When somebody receives a subpoena, it's serious ramifications. Can we get information prior to that step? And I guess what I'm asking is, if that is occurring, and it's been brought to my attention, I haven't seen it directly, would you be willing to review the process? Because I think it would be best if, and I know that's how you run the department, because I was kind of surprised because of the way that we've worked together. If they need information, if the ESOP's willing to provide it, that happens first. And I'm the first one to say if your department or if the Congress isn't getting the information that they've asked for, then the subpoena power is there and that it should be used. But to begin with that step, I think is something I think we should reviewed. And And would you be willing to review that, and any comments on that going forward right now as we're here together? I know this is something you need to look at, but if you have any comments now.
Well, I'm happy to look into this. I must confess, I'm not familiar with the specific concern that is it related to subpoenas in the ESOP context, and I'm more than willing to get back to you. And what I'd love to do is folks who have come in, just like we did before, there's no substitute for getting around the table and listening and seeing what the concerns are and then coming up with a pathway forward. So I'd be more than willing to kind of replicate the model we used before and do it again, because you helped me get smarter, and I'd like to do that again.
Well, my view too is that there needs to be oversight, but if we can do it mutually working together as opposed to the adversarial. But if it gets to that point, then you obviously have the right and the power to do so.
We'll reach out to you. My team will reach out to your staff after today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Desaulniers, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first, thank you for your passion and sincerity to the work you are involved in, and also thank you for your relationship with employers. As a former small business owner who my success in the restaurant business was directly related to my employees and how they interacted with my clients, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to accept that most employers I think want to do the right thing and value their relationship with their employees. So I wanted to ask you a question about a lot of the changes in the relationship between employers and employees, particularly with large companies, and that goes to the issue of contracting out, or a new word I've learned recently, the fissuring of our relationships. So it's been estimated that there are 30 million such workers in 5 industries: in the construction industry, the hospitality industry, janitorial, personal care, and home health care. So clearly this relationship is different. I know when I was in the legislature in California, there were calls both by the Chamber of Commerce and obviously the Labor Federation as how do we more clearly delineate who is a contract employee and who is not. A predecessor of yours recently did an op-ed piece where he suggested, who's now a teacher at the University of California, Berkeley, Secretary Reich, that if you're compensated, 80% of your compensation comes from one source, that should be the definition, and then you could do that administratively right now. So could you talk a little bit about the change, maybe some of the benefits of these relationships if you see them, but also the challenges to make sure that the relationship between a contract employee and their actual employer is accurate, and what that does to the economy potentially as well?
Well, you referenced the fissured workplace, and as you know, David Weil, our wage and hour administrator, quite literally wrote the book on the fissured workplace, and he told me that he had a wonderful visit with you along with my colleague Sharon Block. And when you look at the issues that are confronting us, the fact that we've had flat wages, relatively speaking, and the delinking of productivity increases and real wage growth. There are many factors that explain that, but one of the factors has been the fissuring of the workplace. There's an appropriate role for contractors in the workplace. We employ contractors in a surgical way. Other employers do. But there's undeniably been abuses of that. And we have a very active docket of cases involved in what we call misclassification. And we have MOUs with 29 states because this is an issue in Utah, it's an issue in Arizona, it's an issue in Texas, it's an issue in Massachusetts, it's an issue in California. And so we've been working hard on that. There is a test under current law, and David offered some guidance on misclassification, and that's an issue that is relevant to the legacy economy. It's an issue relevant to the in-demand economy or on-demand economy. It's an issue relevant in every context. And when people are misclassified, they're more vulnerable to injury on the job because they don't get workers' comp. They work overtime and don't get paid overtime. They don't get the benefits that they're really entitled to. And that is why a big focus of our work at the Department of Labor under Administrator Weil's leadership has been addressing this and understanding that there is an appropriate use for contractors, but when there is abuse, we will act. And one of the most frequent set of stakeholders who come to us asking for help are employers like you, because the vast percentage of employers are playing by the rules, but they can't compete if the restaurant down the street is paying everyone under the table and isn't paying workers' comp. That's not fair.
It'd be interesting to look at what the trend is over time in history. With that, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Thompson.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you here. I wanted to zero in on just a follow-up of a piece of legislation that we successfully have obviously passed WIOA, and kind of dovetail that a little bit with what I hope will happen with Perkins as well. I invest a lot of energy and time in just with the partners that are out there with WIOA. I spent a lot of time with our folks, workforce development professionals, individuals that are within and across the board, our educators, our pre-vocational sites for individuals living with disabilities, certainly vocational training sites. And so as co-chair of the Career and Technical Education Caucus here in the House, I certainly want to thank you for highlighting the importance of skill and workforce training. And I agree with your sentiment that the passage of WIO was a tremendous step in the right direction. As a department moves through the process of implementing the final WIO regulations, I ask you to consider the future importance of aligning WIO regs with an updated Perkins Act, which we hope to consider in the coming months in this committee. What are your plans to align both of these crucial workforce development and education bills? And then just a follow-up, how will you ensure that individuals with disabilities are given equal opportunity for success and growth under both of these acts?
Music to my ears to hear those questions. Thank you for your leadership. I can tell you served on a WIB because you know this at the local level. One of the major benefits of WIOA has been the stovepipe implosion at a state and local level and the stovepipe implosion at the federal level. The final regs are a joint venture between DOL and the Department of Education. We're working more closely than ever. And when you mentioned Perkins, my ears perked up because I'm a huge believer. We have undervalued career and technical education as a nation to our detriment. And the synergies of WIOA and Perkins reauthorization, I think, create a remarkable opportunity to address the challenges that you're outlining. We need to fortify the apprenticeship on-ramp and the skills superhighway, and Perkins is a way to do that. We also, to get to your question on people with disabilities, WIOA had a provision creating an advisory committee on the employment of people with disabilities. I've attended at least one of those meetings, and we will be receiving their final report. One of the things I'm most proud of in the work I've done in my federal career and in state government is working with employers and others on the employment of people with disabilities. We all too frequently ignore the first, we focus too much on the first three letters of that word, not enough on the last seven. And we've done a lot of work with employers in Maryland and elsewhere who, for people with disabilities, sometimes transportation is a huge issue. There are so many jobs out there that you can do from home, telecommuting, and so we've done a lot of work in that area. The advisory committee is going to have a series of recommendations about how we empower people with disabilities because, as you know, the labor force participation rate is too low. There are very few people that come to me and say, Tom, I want to be a taxpayer.
Right. Well,
people with disabilities are those folks.
A few seconds I have left. How are we watching carefully? I mean, there are a lot of folks who are in pre-vocational programs where that's very appropriate. Multiple disabilities, not really despite, and I come out of rehabilitation, so I work to try to facilitate adaptation. Yep. But for some folks, and they get so much satisfaction out of that work, and I'm concerned that we just make sure we don't eliminate those opportunities for folks who are not ready for competitive employment.
I totally appreciate that view, and we've heard it from a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Expired. Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good to
Mr.
see you.
Secretary, welcome back to the committee.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for your leadership. I know you're aware of the steps that have been taken in my home state of Oregon for working families, paid sick days, improving the retirement system, raising the state minimum wage, and I'm glad to see that your budget includes many priorities that will help working families in Oregon and across the country. I want to first follow up on Representative Clark's question about paid family leave and appreciate your response to her. It is past time that our country join the rest of the world in offering family leave. It's my understanding that now approximately 25% of women in this country return to work after 2 weeks of giving birth because they have no paid leave. So will you address the issue of, and I also want to mention, even places like the country of Estonia has up to 1.5 years of paid family leave. We have none, and unless it's offered by private employers. So will you talk a little bit about the benefit to business? We know that it benefits families and benefits children to get that strong start in life, but what about the benefits to businesses that are providing paid leave, whether it be through recruitment, retention? How have these businesses seen?
It's been an enormous retention strategy. Businesses I meet, I want to hire the best and the brightest. And so my paid leave policy is giving me a competitive edge. When I travel internationally, I ask the question of everyone. We organize meetings through the chambers in various countries. Been to Australia, England, Germany, Switzerland, Canada. And I ask the following question. If you were king or queen for a day, would you diminish or repeal your paid leave laws? I usually get a 1 or a 2-word answer. The 1-word answer is no, and the 2-word answer for benefit of this committee is heck no.
Probably hard to find a country that doesn't have.
And the reason is because it's part of their competitive advantage. In Canada, what they do when someone's off on leave is they hire a contractor and they kick the tires on that employee so that they can see whether that's someone they might want to hire, instead of using the resume, which is a far more imperfect tool to grow your workforce. So this is the only nation where it's also a partisan issue. I mean, Australia is governed by a conservative ruling party who won their election on a platform of expanding paid leave.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I also wanted to ask you about adjunct faculty at higher education institutions. They typically face low pay, no benefits, if any, lack job security, get inadequate institutional support, and in only a few states can receive unemployment compensation, even though they have no assurance of full-time employment. So what is the Department of Labor doing to address this issue and improve the working conditions for adjunct faculty?
Sure. We've heard about this issue a lot, and I appreciate your continuing interest in this, and we've spoken to a lot of stakeholders. Our guidance, as you know, on eligibility for unemployment benefits is 30 years old, and a lot has changed in the last 30 years. And so what we have been doing is a series of listening sessions to figure out what should the 21st century guidance look like. And we've spoken to folks in higher ed, we've spoken to folks across the spectrum. And again, we've heard from a lot of people like yourself, and we are committed to reaching a workable solution in the coming months on this issue.
Any preview of what direction that's
Well,
going?
we're still listening, so I hate to prejudge it because we've heard from a lot of people, and there's still more people that we need to hear from. And I pride myself in making sure I listen to everyone before we figure out exactly where to
Very
go.
much appreciate that and look forward to working with you. Yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, sir.
How you doing today?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, good. You know, as a businessman for over 35 years, in fact, just 2 years ago, I was out in the business world. And what I found in economic development, the number one factor that a company looks at when they look at your area is the development of a skilled workforce. We've got 46 million people, I think, at last count, who are on some type of government assistance that are, I guess, either underemployed or unemployed. We've got in our education system a number of students who drop out of high school and don't enter the workforce. What's your plan to deal with that? And you've got, like you said, 10 months left. What would you do to change the current circumstances that we're faced with in trying to get folks in the workforce?
Sure. Let me give you a couple examples of things that we're doing. One of the reasons I'm such a big fan of apprenticeship is because apprenticeship provides remarkable opportunities to bring people who have been out of the workforce into the workforce, not only in any job, but in a job with a career ladder. So for instance, South Carolina has a tax credit for employers who hire apprentices. And they've been taking folks who are on TANF, and CVS, who has been a strong partner of ours in this. They're taking folks on TANF. They're putting them into a pharmacy tech apprenticeship program, and they're on a career pathway to a middle-class job. And so those are examples of things that we're doing using the tools in the Workforce Investment Act. And now with WIOA, we have more tools to do that, because I firmly believe, and it's a fundamental tenet of workforce development, that every person is gifted and talented, and there's no such thing as a spare American. And that's why we've done so much work connecting folks, breaking down stovepipes. So we work closer with the TANF folks than ever before. We're working closer with the Department of Education, as Congressman Thompson was talking about, to lift up career and technical education for folks. So I'm very excited about the work that's being done in that area, and if you have other ideas about how we can do that.
Are we making enough progress, though? I mean, it just seems like we're on hold or something. I mean, it's great programs, but how do...
Oh, I mean, I look at the unemployment rate it was 10% in 2010, it's 4.9% now, and you
labor
look at...
participation is the key. I mean,
sorry?
we've got people who aren't participating in the workforce. And
Well, actually, the labor force participation rate last month was at its highest level in over a year, and that's because people have more confidence now that they can get a job. Having said that, I want to continue to work with you and others, because we've had tremendous success linking people who have been on various forms of public assistance to career pathways. That is, for me, a labor of love, and there's nothing better than talking to employers like Andrew Rush at Detroit Manufacturing Systems, who went from 0 employees to 1,200 employees. She manufactures the console for the Ford F-150, and she used the workforce system. She made use of folks who had been out of work for 2-3 years, and she was able to take it to scale with Match.com helping her out.
I'm just about out of time, but the number one impediment to creating jobs, at least in the small business community, is this overreach in the regulatory environment. And I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that. I mean, in other words, from the business standpoint, it's very difficult to make business decisions when you really don't know what the next rule is going to be, and I have to yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good morning.
Good morning, Secretary Perez. I thank you for being here today
Pleasure to be here.
and providing testimony on the President's budget request for the Department of Labor. I commend the President for putting forth a budget that promotes fair wages, safe workplaces, and equal employment opportunities. I hope our committee will join DOL in its efforts by passing legislation and supports working families in these last 10 months. Work with the department rather than against it. There are so many great things that the department is doing, but I just would like to touch upon a few. First, I'm glad that the administration rejected the Bush-era proposal that would have slashed FECA benefits for injured federal workers who have dependents or who have reached retirement age. As you know, in December 2015, I joined Ranking Member Scott, Congressman Cummings, and Congressman Connolly in sending a letter to the Office of Management and Budget on this issue. I commend the administrator's decision to ensure that the workers who have committed themselves to federal service are honored by a system that does not leave them and their families financially worse off than in the injury or death. As you know, I've introduced the Payroll Fraud Prevention Act to combat employee misclassification. In your written testimony, you shared a compelling story of how a CEO shifted his thinking on the issue of misclassification for the betterment of his workers and his company. Can you please share that story with us? And can you speak to how this year's budget will continue to support efforts to combat employee misclassification?
Thank you for your leadership on that issue, and thank you for your question. The issue of worker misclassification has been a chronic problem. When I was in Maryland, we passed some laws on this, and we actually didn't call it misclassification because I don't like that name. It sounds like a clerical error. We called it workplace fraud because that's what it was. When you call a worker an independent contractor when he or she is in fact an employee, that's fraudulent, and we've seen it time and time again. And again, as I mentioned, the drywall example that you're referring to was a case that we investigated in Arizona and Utah, and you had construction workers who were employees on a Friday, and then we're told, congratulations, on Monday, you're now employee partners. Sounds good, but it's too good to be true, and that's because they wanted to lower their costs. And the good news is that we were able to settle that case, and we worked with state governments in Utah and Arizona. And I point that out because this is not a partisan issue. Misclassification is in every state in the country, and it hurts workers and businesses who play by the rules alike.
Thank you.
And by the way, the employer in the Arizona case, the postscript to this has been that he participated in a Future of Work conference that we had back in December at the Department of Labor, and he has become one of our strongest supporters in this issue that you're talking about. So I really appreciate his leadership.
Just want to touch on silica before we run out of time. How is DOL planning to work with OMB to finalize this life-saving rule that has been in the book since 1974?
Well, I'll tell you, when you walk into the work in the morning, you have a right to be coming home safe and sound. And it shouldn't be killing you. And silica, we've known about the dangers of silica for 80 years. And we have been working with every stakeholder involved on this issue. And and the proposed final rule is at OMB now, and we hope to bring it to conclusion in the very near future.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and more bad news for my colleagues. I'm reducing the time to 3 minutes as we are rapidly approaching the 12 o'clock hour. Mr. Byrne, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary,
Morning,
thanks for being here. I'd like to talk to you today about the Office of Labor Management Standards work that they're doing on a proposed persuader rule under the Labor Management Reporting Disclosure Act. Just so you know, I'm a labor lawyer from South Alabama. We don't have very many big employers. Most of our businesses that employ people in South Alabama don't have HR departments. They may have somebody that's in charge of HR that's got half a dozen other things they're responsible for. So when they're in a situation where there's a union organizing campaign going on, they don't really have anybody in-house that they can go to help them. They've got to go get somebody like me, and there are a number of very fine lawyers down in our neck of the woods that do that. Now, the problem is that up until now, it's been a pretty good bright line test. If the lawyers that were given that advice weren't actually communicating with employees, we weren't covered by any sort of a persuader rule. Without a bright line test, that's going to put these lawyers in a very difficult position, but more importantly, it puts those employers in a difficult position because they don't know what the law is. And there's no way a small to medium-sized business can know this area of the law because it's so fairly granulated, as you know very well. The American Bar Association has registered its very strong concerns about attorney-client privilege issues here. And as a lawyer yourself, you know how important that is. Now, here's the truth. The unions, when they go on these organizing campaigns, I'm not saying they don't tell the truth, they're selective about which truths they tell. And the only way for an employee to get the entire picture is if the employer talks to them. And under the labor laws, the employer has a right to talk to their employees. But there are rules about what the employer can say and do, and rules about what the employer can't say and can't do. Now, if the employer can't turn to a lawyer that's a professional in this area and say, tell me what I can say and do, and also tell me what I can't say and do, without the fear on the lawyer's part that the lawyer is going to be brought under this rule, then effectively we've denied legal counsel to the employers, and just as importantly, we've denied crucial information to the employees before they make that very important decision when they go to vote on whether or not they want a union. So I want to register that concern to you, and in the 30 seconds that are left, please give me some information that would tell me that you're not going to put us in a situation where lawyers are effectively prohibited from giving that sort of advice.
There's nothing in the proposed rule that is currently under consideration, by the way. There's nothing in the proposed rule that prohibits the employer from saying anything. to their client. The LMRDA requires that consultants report their agreements that are designed to persuade employees directly or indirectly. That's not my words. That's what Congress passed in 1959 about whether or not to choose to join a union. And in 1959, when Congress debated this, the attorney-client privilege was brought up as a reason not to have the word indirectly in there or something of that nature, and Congress explicitly rejected that. So this is about transparency. This isn't about affecting attorney-client
Mr.
relations.
Secretary, I'm out of time, but I'd like to have a discussion with you away from here because I think you and I have a different view of that. I yield back.
Gentleman
When we're
yields
done with
back.
the rule, we'd
Thanks
be
for
happy
trying
to
to
do that.
navigate the 3 minutes. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your dedication, Mr. Secretary. I know you've had a chance to talk a lot about workforce training this morning, and I wanted to just go to the transition between the WIOA and what we currently have from the perspective of the workforce centers and the fact that they're going to be moving, as I understand it, to a more competitive process in who's going to be running those centers. Since the transition is going to be required by at least the beginning of 2017, are there plans to make certain that the workforce boards are going to be able to transition with those competitive operation process, essentially, which really is probably more complicated than they faced in the past?
Sure. Well, one of the key provisions of WIOA that Congress passed was a requirement to competitively bid the one-stop centers so that it can help increase accessibility to the centers and the services that they offer. And we certainly understand that intent, and our regulations, our proposed regulations, are designed to do that. We're also excited about how local areas and states that can make use of the flexibility to accomplish this. And so we have done a lot of outreach in this area. We've gotten a number of questions from folks because in some communities, the same entity has been operating the center for some time.
Right, exactly.
And so we're very cognizant of that fact. By the same token, we're aware and cognizant and intend to be compliant with the direction from Congress that we have competitive bidding, and that's the process that we find ourselves in right now. And we've spent a lot of time on this issue, again, listening and learning from communities to make sure we get it right at the end.
Okay, thank you. So if, in fact, those boards might even need an extension, and that's possible to work with them to be sure that.
We look for, if you have specific questions relating to particular circumstances, I would simply, we obviously have had a long and open line of communication, so
Great,
please
great.
let us
And
know.
California is
and we'll
well
follow
on
up.
their way here, but I know that it can be an issue. And just very quickly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is interested in collecting data which would help them understand more the issues that have been talked about here in terms of contractor-employee relations, contingent workers, and I'm wondering what we actually can learn. What would we like to know about capturing the information of these individuals, and how might that inform our future programs for the American workforce?
We had a summit on the future of work, and the nature of work is changing. And one of the primary takeaways was we need to make sure we're studying with granularity how the workforce is changing, how technology affects it, and what we can do as a result to make sure that businesses succeed, workers succeed, communities succeed.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony today. Good to have you here this morning. I wanted to build on the question that was raised by my colleague, Dr. Poe, earlier regarding the fiduciary rule. I know that you've received a number of comments during this open comment period. It is a proposed rule that has caused great consternation out there. I hear on a daily basis many who have raised their concerns with me on this issue. And I know that specifically you've received a significant number of comments on the treatment of the variable annuity products under the proposed fiduciary rule, and that many of these comments have suggested keeping variable annuities within the prior exemption, prohibited transaction exemption 84-24, and that they and other insurance and annuity products insurance and annuity products have enjoyed since 1970s. So this is a significant change of path in this proposed rule. If this is not something the department is considering, it's important that the final rule clarify the treatment of variable annuities under the best in contract exemption and permit the use of commissions and sales of proprietary products without imposing unnecessary and burdensome conditions. Specifically, I would ask you to inform the committee as to what modifications to the best in contract exemption the department is considering in order to provide a clear and workable path to make variable annuities available to clients when these products would be in the client's best interest.
Sure. During both the informal process before we had the formal rulemaking and during the formal notice and comment process and the hearings that we held, we received a lot of comments on the issues that you raised, and I can assure you that we've taken them seriously. We had a number of meetings with various stakeholders, often at the request of members of Congress, and we're in the process now of finalizing the rules, so I can't get too detailed, but I can certainly assure you that when we reach the end of this process, we'd be more than willing to explain what the proposal was, what changes were made, and why we did what we did.
Quick follow-up. You do recognize that the issue is one that has been raised by several individuals, several companies, several clients that are impacted by this, and that it is an issue that you're working on.
It's absolutely an issue that we've heard about and are working on.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Polis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Good to see you.
To our committee. Great to see you. Always a pleasure. As you know, part of our bipartisan budget deal required a catch-up for civil monetary penalties to keep up with inflation, for OSHA penalties, for instance, which hadn't been increased since 1990 and had actually been carved out for annual adjustment. The Fair Labor Standards Act has a maximum civil monetary penalty of $1,100 for each willful and repeated violation of, for instance, the minimum wage or overtime pay provisions of the law. And of course, stolen wages can also be recouped, but the punitive aspect is limited to that $1,100, which often is completely insufficient as a deterrent. And what I wanted to ask you to ensure that there's a real deterrent to willful or repeated wage theft or failure to pay overtime, what types of additional penalties, such as criminal penalties or increased civil penalties, could we look at to ensure that violations of our wage and hour laws are not simply a cost of doing business?
Sure. Two dimensions to the question. Number one, the provision as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act directed us to issue a rule, an interim final rule by July 1st to implement the inflation adjustments, and I want to assure you that we're on track to get that done. The second dimension of your question, though, I think goes beyond that and reflects the fact that in a lot of the work that we do, the fines are amount, in the opinion of many businesses that I've spoken to, their cost of doing business. And as a result, they don't have the adequate deterrent. We just finished the prosecution of the aftermath of the Upper Big Ranch disaster, where over 24 people died, and the penalties just don't fit the crime, and that's unfortunate. And so, and that not only hurts the victims and their families, but it hurts employers who play by the rules. So I certainly look forward to working with you in that, and there's a bipartisan support. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people about that issue.
Great. And finally, I wanted to address within Workforce Investment Act, the Department of Labor's efforts to ensure that immigrants, including limited English proficient job seekers and workers, are able to acquire English and the skills they need to reach their full potential. I want to know how you're working with states to ensure that the needs of English language learners, immigrants, generally called literacy programs, are being met.
I first started working on this issue when I was a local elected official in county government. Then I led this issue when I was in state government, and now I have the privilege of working on this issue here. And WIOA has imploded stovepipes between the Department of Education and the Department of Labor in remarkable ways that will have, among other things, the benefit of helping English language learners not only get the English language instruction, but then get access to the job opportunities. And it is a targeted population with barriers so that we can focus on them. And I very much appreciate that question because it's very near and dear to my heart.
Great.
Gentleman's time has expired. I think we're going to make it here with 5 minutes to spare. Depends on the ranking member. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No pressure.
No pressure. Mr. Secretary, yesterday I met with my local Workforce Development Board, and they expressed gratitude for the outreach efforts by the department in the WIA implementation. And so I want to thank you for those efforts, making sure that WIA implementation goes in the best way possible. One of the problems we've had with this hearing, Mr. Chairman, is a lot of the issues that we're discussing are in the middle of rulemaking, and so the Secretary is restrained on what he can say, and we're restrained on what we know because we haven't seen the proposed rules. But we do have a proposed rule on overtime that's been discussed, and we heard about the option that some people want to take to work 80 hours a week. We decided decades ago that if you work more than 40 hours a week, the principle is that you ought to get time and a half for the hours after 40. But the way inflation has worked, most of the workers who work more than 40 hours a week, who are technically on salary but would have been covered under the old regulations, not only don't get time and a half, they don't get anything. So if you're paying for daycare while you're working, you've got to pay for the daycare, and you're getting absolutely no compensation for those extra hours. Mr. Chair, so we're looking forward to that regulation so that the same portion of workers that were getting overtime when we passed the rule to begin with still get it. I want to thank you for your work on silica and beryllium and look forward to those regulations taking place, and for your efforts to address wage theft, starting with the requirement that federal contractors, the employees of federal contractors, get a pay stub so that they can ascertain whether or not they're getting ripped off. And so, Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate the Secretary for 72 consecutive months of job growth. That is a record by far. I think the last 2 years he's been setting a new record every month. We still have a long way to go, but at least clearly we're going in the right direction. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Secretary, this conversation went pretty much as I think we expected it might. You, as the ranking member said, you've got a number of rules that are in the rulemaking process, and we don't have full visibility into that, but we have concerns, and those concerns were expressed by a number of my colleagues on the fiduciary rule, which I know you've heard about almost every waking hour, because if you haven't, believe me, I have. The joint employer, the relationship between franchisors and franchisees, there's a lot of concern out there. There is a lot of concern, and we need to see what that's going to look like. The persuader rule that Mr. Byrne, our resident labor lawyer here, was talking about seems to me to be a clear infringement on the rights of the employers, the ability for employees to get information, and concerns for those lawyers that have to be called in because, as Mr. Byrne said, your small businesses, they don't have a legal team there. They probably don't have an HR department, and they need that counsel. So I am concerned, and I know many are concerned, and based on the visits to my office and the calls and the emails, and then there is some disagreement over overtime. The threshold that's been, we've seen in the proposed rule is, I think, $53,000, which if you're in parts of rural America is an awful lot of money. Maybe not in New York, but in a lot of places. So there are very real concerns, and we're very anxious to look into these rules. Maybe magic has occurred from our perspective, and the rules have now come out to be perfectly reasonable, but they don't look like that right now. So our concerns are high. We're going to continue to look at this and work with you and your staff. I was committed to noon. I think I'm going to make it by 30 seconds. I want to thank you for your testimony and your active engagement in our questions and answers. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.